Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're reviewing the brand new DLC for Total War Warhammer 2, The Shadow and the Blade. Bringing new factions, lords, units, and campaigns to the Dark Elves and the Skaven, The Shadow and the Blade brings some favorites into the game in great style, but is there enough substance? Before we dive in, I'd like to thank the folks at Creative Assembly for giving me early access to the DLC so that I could prepare this review before it released. As always, and as will be pretty evident, that does not affect my opinion in any way. On another note, if you're interested in picking the DLC up after you watch this review, feel free to use my Humble Bundle link that I'll include in the description down below and under the eye at the top right corner of this screen. Doing so helps the channel as well as charity. With all that out of the way, let's see if The Shadow and the Blade is a 5 ninja star type of DLC, or the type that should have been kept locked away like some demon. As I mentioned earlier, the DLC focuses on the Skaven and the Dark Elves. The Skaven receive a new faction in the form of Clan Eshin, led by none other than Deathmaster Snikch, chief assassin of Clan Eshin, a clan known for its tendency to lurk in the shadows and excel in stealthy endeavors. Seeing him at the head of an army is, if I recall correctly, not something we've seen or read of before, but that doesn't stop Creative Assembly from creating a very deadly, efficient, and fun legendary lord out of him. The Dark Elves receive a new faction as well, Hag Graef, led by Malus Darkblade, the ruthless individual who finds himself a vessel for the demon Tz'arkan. A definite fan favorite, Malus Darkblade's appearance was an inevitability if you ask me. The question always was how the demon within him would be executed. Turns out, that demon is the core plot point that binds the two new factions and legendary lords together in a head-to-head scenario. Let's first talk about all the new units that both factions are getting. Lords included, we're seeing a total of 18 units spread between the two factions. Apart from the Deathmaster and Malice, we see a new Lord type for each faction with the Master Assassin for Skaven and the High Beastmaster for the Dark Elves. We also see a new agent for the Skaven, the Eshin Sorcerer that wields the Skaven spells of Stealth, a great new set of spells with a decent bit of variety coming fresh with this DLC as well. Meanwhile, the Dark Elves get an anti-large agent in the form of a Master. The Skaven receive units that fit the Clan Eshin theme, Triads, the Regiments of Renown, and a Regiment of Renown for Death Runners, and a few more units that certainly feel more in tune with Clan Scryer, Warp Grinders, Poisonwind Mortars, and their Regiment of Renown as well. The Dark Elves, meanwhile, receive a new Chariot and its Regiment of Renown, both of which are absolutely gorgeous models. They also get the Bloodrack Medusa, and the same atop a shrine, as well as a new Regiment of Renown for Harpies and the one Bloodrack Medusa as well. The units are all great additions to the rosters. The Skaven get some additional options for cheeky, sneaky play, as well as some absolutely devastating artillery, while the Dark Elves get some powerful anti-large ranged chariots and magical ranged damage from the monsters. They're a pleasure to look at and are well animated. I'm not a big fan of the Bloodrack Medusa as it gets tossed around. It's an understandably difficult model to rig and animate. It often looks like the animations are pushing the model in ways it's not supposed to move. You can kind of see textures stretching, you can see, sharp edges and the polygons kind of twisting in ways they're not supposed to. Very distracting, especially if you're, zooming in for some cinematic looks at battles and whatnot. Nitpicking aside, they all look great. They have interesting traits and abilities as well, and they feel like compelling additions. Whether in single or multiplayer, I think all of the new units will have a place in the game, which is very important that they're not just being added in for the sake of adding more units, but have a place, or they change the way the factions play a little bit, and I think that's been accomplished quite well by this DLC. In battle, Malice is certainly the more interesting addition, thanks to his ability to transform into Tz'arkan. Embracing the demon within allows him to fully replenish his health and fatigue, get buffs to certain stats, and gain access to a different set of abilities. The downside to this is the slow, per-tick damage that is caused to Malice when he's in this form. Damage that can kill him and cause the associated morale damage to the rest of the army. In single player, he returns immediately after the battle, albeit at 1 hit point, and in multiplayer, it doesn't quite matter what happens to him after death. His abilities, when in regular Dark Elf form, are also intriguing in that they make him damage himself as he taps into the assistance from the demon. This almost becomes a dance of balancing ability uses and the perfect time to trigger the transformation to avoid otherwise certain death. On the campaign as well, you'll see his skill tree actually has some options which are based on his, Tz'arkan form or not being in Tz'arkan form. So they definitely embrace this duality when it comes to fighting and also on the campaign. Now, by comparison, we're still talking about battles over here, Deathmaster Snikch is a much simpler addition from a mechanics perspective, but from a visual and flair perspective, he's certainly more interesting. His animations are a lot of fun to watch. When he disappears into plumes of smoke just to pop out elsewhere like some rodent version of Nightcrawler, it's absolutely amazing. It's thrilling to watch is the word I would use, honestly. His voice acting is also exceptional in my opinion, and his overall impact on the battlefield is great. As far as special abilities, he's got a Vortex ability that helps him when he's surrounded, and he's got the Deathmaster's Sigil that helps him pin an enemy lord or hero in place so he can hunt them down. If I'm completely honest, both of these guys feel pretty well balanced in terms of interest level in battle. They both have special abilities, nice animations, a cool mechanic here or there. Malice just edges out, of course. Sorry, can't avoid the edge joke there. He just edges Snikch out because, of course, he's got this whole transformation mechanic, which is completely different and completely new, and it's very well executed and implemented as well. Now, just really briefly, I mentioned the new lore of magic, the Skaven spells of stealth. It's a great set of spells, bringing things like the stealthy skitter leap to a highly cost-efficient magic missile in Warp Stars, to great debuffs and buffs between Brittle Bone and Armor of Darkness, to interesting support spells to lock enemies in place or create space while bringing in damage with a stationary vortex. The spells look great, but at this point I expect nothing less from the FX artists working on these pieces of content. Now let's talk about the campaigns. Both factions have been added to both campaign types, of course, with interesting start locations in either. Especially interesting considering the eastward expansion the Mortal Empires map has received, and what that might imply for the next game, but I digress. The two are pitted against each other in the storyline of the Vortex campaign because Snikch has been sent out to find an unknown source of power, a source that just so happens to be Tz'arkan. Malus, meanwhile, is just trying to find release from the demon that possesses him, release that Malekith promises in exchange for assistance in acquiring the scrolls of Hecate. Snikch and Clan Eshin have some very interesting mechanics, and it certainly feels like the Rats are a top faction among the Creative Assembly devs or something. Shadowy dealings and clan contracts are both interesting representations of Clan Eshin's ways. The former allows you to use a resource called schemes in order to perform various actions to help your campaign along, as long as you're willing to assign a suitable agent or lord to said task and have them disappear for a handful of turns. The effects of the shadowy dealings are instant, and they can do anything from bring in money and food on the cheap end, to damage enemy armies and buildings for middling scheme costs, to stealing entire Skaven holds, turncoating their armies, or even stealing undercities right from underneath their noses on the high end of costs, with the most expensive options needing to be executed by Snikch specifically, allowing you to do ridiculously powerful things like sink an entire faction into anarchy by magically snapping them away. The one shadowy dealing, the Night Lord Say So, is a campaign requirement, and the game needs you to complete 3. Each one gives you access to more schemes after having you fight different armies that spawn near you, battles brought about by Snikch's hunt for the Great Power. On the flip side, Clan Eshin is also able to execute contracts for other Great Skaven clans, using characters in a way similar to shadowy dealings, balancing their favor between Moors, Molder, Scryer, and Pestilence in order to reap benefits including better diplomatic relations, improved resource production like food, or reduced recruitment cost. That last bit is especially important considering the fact that Clan Eshin, by default, pays double the price for recruiting any non-Clan Eshin units. That's everything from clan rats to hell-pit abominations. Pair this with a couple new powerful clan-appropriate rights, well-plotted skill trees for Snikch, Master Assassins, and Eshin Sorcerers, and fun starting positions, and you've got yourself a very fun campaign with cool new mechanics and a fun set of objectives, though it certainly feels abruptly short if you're just playing the Vortex campaign storyline. Malus Darkblade and Hag Graef, meanwhile, feel a little undercooked. We saw this with the previous DLC, where one faction seemed favored, and here it definitely feels like the same thing has happened. While on the battlefield, both factions have some cool new toys and tools to play with, on the campaign map, Malice is relegated to simply collecting scrolls of Hecate and sending them to Malekith in order to get the recipe for the elixir that keeps the demon at bay. So, you're just doing the typical Total War thing of fighting, conquering, and fighting some more, all while building the same buildings you did as base game Dark Elves to farm those scrolls. The only big difference is that every once in a while the screen turns slightly purple and you can hear the demon talk to you. But apart from that, every shipment, though, brings with it a battle, one that actively comes chasing after you, and winning these battles gives you some hefty benefits. There are only two big differentiators here, I would say. One is that Malus starts with Hag Graef and an army near it, alongside his own expedition just off the coast of the Southlands, including a Black Ark. He's presented with the option very early on to abandon the city of Hag Graef in return for a tempting sum of cash. The other is, of course, his possession. The possession mechanics, unfortunately, is just a couple of things. One is a number line that is either swinging left or right, with either extreme giving buffs and debuffs that fit the circumstances. Being possessed to the highest degree prevents replenishment for armies across the board and might stir loyalty issues, while reduced possession levels remove certain abilities and reduce stats. Possession trends upwards towards you being more possessed, and in fact, that campaign actually starts with you being fully possessed. You can use an elixir to drop your possession down to 0, however, that cost of using the elixir increases, so you literally have to pay gold to use the elixir and drop your possession level. Now, on top of that, you will occasionally get whispers. These are missions that are suggested to you by the voice in your head, missions whose completion will make you even more possessed, but will give you some benefits too. Now, since possession trends upwards to begin with, I didn't often find myself chasing after these missions, especially if I felt like they were particularly hard to get to. But that's about it, really. There are new rights to use, and again, Malice is fun on the battlefield, but I can't help but feel like his campaign simply doesn't have as much going for him as Snikch. That's not to say it's bad, mind you, it's just not as inventive or clever, and it doesn't bring as much freshness to the game. The Dark Elves and Skaven have both been in the game since day one, and while I feel like I'm playing a new Skaven campaign and faction with Snikch, it just sort of feels like more of the same with Malice, with only slight differentiators. It all revolves around the Scrolls of Hikari again. It's a thing I've done before, I've collected them before, now it's not even for my own personal gain. Only tangentially, I guess. It doesn't feel as big or grand, I should say. Now, apart from that, I feel like there is some room for polish. Open hands holding swords and staffs, and weapons clipping through the models from time to time. You know, the hand not having a proper grip when it is a closed grip. It's just a little bit of polish missing, I suppose. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, the Medusa models can be a little wonky at times, despite how good they look when idling. And finally, Malus transforming into Tz'arkan is a little underwhelming. The animation has the model disappear and reappear, and the swap is very evident. Now, most of these issues are very easily fixed with some patches, and hell, some might be done in time for release. The biggest issue is definitely the lack of differentiating elements for Malice and the Dark Elves of Hag Graef. I've already collected the Scrolls of Hikari, like I said. I've done it enough times as the Dark Elves. I'll need to do it again. The length of the new Skaven campaign is strangely short too, but at least there are lots of new mechanics to play with if you're going for a sandbox playthrough. As many of you know, I avoid giving numerical scores to games in DLC. I feel like the numbers can be a little arbitrary, and they can lead to strange comparisons between games. What matters most is the value for money. Did the DLC bring me joy and happiness, and would I be willing to part with my money to experience said joy and happiness? Total War Warhammer 2 DLC is a strange beast. Fans of the factions that are being represented, in this case the Skaven and the Dark Elves, have a definite reason to buy. You get new campaigns, beautifully built and thought out new units, and more playtime added to the base game that you're bound to enjoy because you like the faction you're playing as. For folks who aren't particularly inclined towards either faction, the DLC does, I would say, 3/4 of the job. The Skaven editions are extremely compelling, and more interesting than mechanics I've seen introduced in most past DLC, I think. The shadowy dealings are the types of mechanics I want to see in future Total War games, historical and otherwise. Clan contracts are also very interesting as a concept, though they could have been a bit more complex and involved, I would say. On the flip side, while the Dark Elves are getting some fun new toys to play with, I can't help but feel like their campaign just falls short. The Darkblade campaign, and I hate to say this, feels like a bit of an afterthought, the kind of idea and solution one might provide when the deadline is extremely quickly approaching. As a big Skaven fan, the DLC checks a bunch of boxes: new spells, new units, new campaigns, new lore, new faction, and compelling new mechanics. And honestly, for $10, that's not a bad deal at all. Dark Elves get the short end of the stick, but they still have cool new units and battle mechanics from Malice. He's a very interesting lord, So if you just don't care for these factions at all, and you don't play multiplayer, then you might not care for the DLC until you next decide to play as one of them. And that's completely fair, but it's hard to argue with a $10 price tag. I actually had to go and double check the price on Steam because I was surprised to see it that cheap. As always, make sure you subscribe to this channel for more Total War and strategy gaming content, and feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. A massive thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons for supporting the channel on a monthly basis, and a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.